So this morning's presentation and panel were very stimulating, to say the least. And one of the things that came up in each of the sets of presentations had to do with what is the impact of these policies and the policy changes and the evolving policy sort of climate have to do with respect to the public health impact. So on the one hand, we have policies that are meant to be regulatory of more the business side, but each and every one of the presenters at one point or another commented on this afternoon's topic areas. And that had to do with policy impacting on public health, and it had to do with policy as it may impact on prevention and intervention. So this afternoon's presentations really focus on that. The first set of those really focuses on issues of public health, and I want to introduce our moderator for this first panel in the afternoon, and that's Dr. Caleb Banta-Green. Caleb is a senior research scientist at the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute and also an affiliate associate professor in the Department of Health Services in the School of Public Health. Caleb is probably better known to some of you as the voice of ADAI on the radio, as he talks about the opioid overdose issues and concerns, but he also has a focus over the recent past and has been driven, so to speak, to investigate issues of marijuana with the automobile. So I couldn't resist. So this afternoon's focus will be, in fact, looking at issues having to do with marijuana and driving, marijuana and pregnancy, and then what's being offered to people seeking help in the context of each of the states in which legalization has taken place. So, Caleb?
Good afternoon. We have a great panel, and I'm very happy to say that these are all colleagues of mine, and I'm honored to be working with them, and I think we'll have a great discussion. I'm going to start off by introducing Dr. Stacy Hoff, and she joined the Washington Traffic Safety Commission in 2012 as the Director of Research at the Research and Data Division. Prior to that, she was at the Washington State Department of Health and as an epidemiologist there, where we had some interaction. She has built partnerships and identified unique data sources for studying the impacts of marijuana legalization on traffic safety in Washington State. Stacy led the effort to develop a new data set that links drivers involved in fatal crashes to complete toxicology outcomes. You will see why that's important in a moment. And information that is currently not available in any other state. So we're really developing really rich data to answer, and I learned also personally a phenomenally complex question to really study well. The data that she's been developing is also available for use by other researchers, and today she's here to provide an overview of this data and an early look at 2015. So please welcome Stacy.
Hi, thanks for having me here today. Thanks for that introduction, Caleb. Kind of gave away my first slide, kind of the punchline that marijuana in crashes, marijuana impaired driving is nothing new. It's been happening for about 40 years or more, so everyone keeps asking us, what are you doing about this? Same thing we've been doing for 40 years. We're trying to prevent impaired drivers from being on the road. So no surprise, marijuana has always been probably the most available drug, even when it was not legal. So not surprisingly, it's also always been the dominant drug, not including alcohol, in fatal crashes. And that continues to be true today with the legalization in Washington, and it was true with medical marijuana, and it was true before medical marijuana. So people ask me all the time, does marijuana use increase crash risk? You know, it's funny, we were talking about this at lunch, and if you ever want just some entertainment because you're bored, go out and look at research regarding marijuana and driving. It's hilarious, some of it. Especially the discussion sessions. And hopefully I can talk a little bit today about why that is and why when you're looking at research regarding marijuana and driving, we have to be a little bit careful. So does marijuana use increase crash risk? Ultimately, we don't know yet. And here's some comparisons. Sorry, there's a little typo on my slide there. That top one is supposed to be alcohol greater than 0.12. And even in these other areas, like alcohol, that have been very well studied with much stronger methodology than marijuana has been studied, the range of crash risk that you're going to see presented in the literature is incredibly broad. So with an alcohol BAC of over 0.12, in the literature will show you it ranges from 20 to 200 times your crash risk. Alcohol between 0.05 and 0.08, 5 to 30. Alcohol less than 0.05, so that's like a beer, 1.5 times to 3 times. Distraction, 3 to 23 times the crash risk. Drowsy driving, 1.25 up to 4, and actually more recent studies have shown it all the way up to 10 times the crash risk. I don't know quite how they measure that, but marijuana, 2 to 4 times the crash risk. Right now, with the research that's available, it's kind of generally being accepted at double the crash risk. I'm sure some of you that have been following that research, that messaging has heard that, double the crash risk. So that's kind of where we stand today with what we know in comparison. So the problem with data, this goes back to the entertaining research that you can go out there and find. And a lot of that research, at least when it comes to traffic, is done on the NHTSA data, National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, has a census of all fatal crashes that happen in the nation. That's called FARS. It's an incredibly rich data source. I mean, it's standardized across all states, so fatal crash data is collected on a multitude of forms, and in some states even have multiple forms to collect that information. Washington, fortunately, just has one. And a piece of the FARS data is to gather toxicology outcomes from labs to enter into the fatal crash data system. So one thing that makes Washington very special and opportunistic for this type of research is we have centralized toxicology in this state. That means that all toxicology testing, well, the majority of it, I should say, goes to the Washington State Patrol Toxicology Lab for testing, which means at the same time that all of our data is also centralized at that place. So Dr. Cooper, our state toxicologist, has a fantastic lab, has a fantastic staff, wonderful to work with, and gives us very, very detailed THC information that we get to turn gold back into hay and enter it into the FARS data system using this code set. And this cracks me up, because I always say, what is the difference between Delta-9 and THC? What is the difference between hashish oil and hashish, and what toxicologist reports hashish on the toxicology form? So that's a massive limitation, and any of you thinking about doing marijuana research in traffic safety, as you're looking through the literature, if you see FARS, National FARS as the data source, you can go ahead and stop right there and go on to your next study. So what did we do? We have known this has been a problem long before I-502. Anybody looks at the data, you're kind of like, what? What? And you know, when the owner of the data source releases a paper that says, if you want to do drug research, don't use our data, which is exactly what NHTSA did, that's a problem. And when I-502 was coming about, we knew we were going to be asked questions. They were already asking questions, and we had full toxicology reports sitting in paper files at our office and electronically as hay. So we took the gold, which was the paper form, and manually entered. My amazing FAR staff worked overtime for 6 months to manually enter 5 years of data. And not only did they enter the marijuana information, they entered the full toxicology information. And that's a lot. So to give you some perspective, we entered up to 15 drug results, and I don't think any people had 15, but the most drugs one driver had was 10 different drugs who was in a fatal crash. So we had that for people that were deceased. For surviving drivers, that information was being exchanged electronically, and because of our needs at the time, it was only given us as positive or negative. And of course, we know in Washington and other states we have a per se, so the level of marijuana was also really important. So Dr. Cooper and her amazing staff went through and abstracted the detailed drug type and the level of all of the surviving drivers and gave us that. We also did this for the occupants and non-motorists. I don't know how well this is known, but we have an RCW in our state that says if you die from a traffic crash within 4 hours of that crash, your blood's going to be tested. So it doesn't matter if you're a bicyclist or a pedestrian and you get hit. If you die, they're going to test your blood. that RCW is so important because overall, we have about a 60% testing rate among our drivers in fatal crashes, and that's one of the reasons why we have such a high testing rate compared to other states that have 0% that they test. We're one of the higher testing states, which is also very opportunistic for research here. So we already had the amazing FARS record. Besides the drugs in FARS, it's a good data set to really dig down into all of the facets that happen in crash from engineering and behavior and roadway geometry and weather and all those things that can affect those incidences. So right here is the link to the report. What we did in October is take the 5 years of data that we had, so that's the other thing that makes this data special, is we were able to abstract it for a short time period prior to I-502 passing and retail stores opening. We didn't do anything fancy. There's no fun statistics in there right now because the first step is always just describing the data, and that's what we did. Even without anything fancy in that report, though, we found some really interesting things that I hope I am able to convey well today and see more research around what I think needs to be done with marijuana and traffic safety. So just a quick overview of what we found. There's that 60% tested rate that I mentioned earlier. And of those, there was just over 1,000. There's 3,000 total drivers that we looked at, just over 3,000. 1,700 were tested for alcohol and drugs, and approximately 1,000 came back positive. So what's interesting is that blue at the bottom pie of those that came back as positive, that blue slice is alcohol only. The green slice is all the different ways that you can see THC, cannabinoids actually, which includes the carboxymetabolite, and we'll get into that a little bit more in a minute. About a third of the drivers tested positive for THC or cannabinoids, but most often, and that's what you see there, that little dark green spot, that's cannabinoids only. The rest of those green slices is either mixed with alcohol or other drugs, and that's important. And then other drugs is huge. So here is what the numbers look like. So Caleb mentioned earlier that I would explain why it's so important to have that detailed toxicology, because if you just look at FARS, you get the information of anybody that's used cannabinoids in the past couple weeks, because we all know how long it can stay in the system and be detected in the blood. And that's all we had to go on. So what we were able to do then is really dig down into the delta-9 THC, which is the substance known to be impairing. And of all these 3,000 drivers, and even if we look smaller than that and just look at the 1,700 that were actually tested for drugs and alcohol, 56 total drivers have only THC and not combined with other drugs, not combined with alcohol. That's what's missing in the research. If you see this research, especially using fatal crash data, and they're trying to describe marijuana, most of them also have alcohol. And that's important because THC by itself doesn't look like alcohol, and it doesn't look like THC and alcohol combined, and yet we're making some really strong conclusions and opinions about the effect of marijuana, when really in most cases it's being influenced by alcohol as well. So an early look at 2015, we had an additional 24 drivers. There was over 700 drivers involved in fatal crashes in 2015. So of those 700, we added 24 more that had THC only. Kind of the same information over time. The other thing that we did is create these mutually exclusive categories. So those ones in yellow, those are the ones that the report really focused on. So there is some 2015 information here. One of the things I get asked all the time is, well, testing must have gone up, right? Because we're looking for marijuana now. It must have gone up. It went down in 2014 and 2015. It was approximately 55% of drivers, down from 60 in the previous years. And that has a lot to do with the McCleary case and being required to get a warrant to do a blood draw, even when you're involved in a fatal crash. So for some perspective, this is that same information in a chart. That top line is alcohol only. We have done some amazing things to deal with alcohol and fatal crashes. In fact, in 2015, it was the lowest point that it's been ever, and drug involvement was the highest point it's been ever, as long as we've been tracking it. Now, keep in mind that that red line on top, that's alcohol only. So there's additional alcohol that's mixed with other drugs as well. This is the number of fatalities that involved these drivers. Now I'm going to throw everybody for a loop. I'm sure that you've heard in the media that in 2014 it doubled. Our fatalities did not double. The number of drivers where we detected THC doubled. In 2014, and it doesn't matter if you're looking at AAA imputed data, it doesn't matter if you're looking at our raw data, it doesn't matter how you look at it. Yes, it doubled from approximately 40 to 80. But guess what? In 2015, we had a 23% increase in fatalities, the highest it's been since 2007. That's unfortunate. We've been really, really flat, and we had a significant increase that we didn't see coming in 2015. Marijuana didn't change at all. Didn't change at all. Even with an additional 100 people dying on our roads, the marijuana involvement stayed exactly the same. So what we think happened is, yes, there was something that happened in 2014, it doubled. It stayed the same, which means this is probably just the new norm. This is what we can kind of expect in fatal crashes regarding THC. So some of this I'm going to go through rather quickly, but the message here before I start these next couple slides is, again, THC by itself does not look like THC mixed with alcohol. THC mixed with alcohol looks like alcohol on steroids. Wrap your head around that, huh? All right, let's look at the number of units involved. Alcohol typically have a really hard time staying on the road, so you drive off the road and hit a tree. God forbid you hit a ped, but most of the time they're hitting trees, so we call those single unit. Means they're out there kind of killing themselves. The majority of alcohol-involved drivers are single unit. The majority of THC-only drivers are multi-unit. A unit can be a car or a pedestrian or a bicyclist, so to put that in perspective, that's kind of a scary stat. THC drivers aren't driving off the road and hitting trees. They are being involved in crashes that involve others. And that's all I'll say about that, because that's really all we know about that at this point. Day versus night, alcohol is weekend, nighttime, right? Well, THC is happening during the day, and the weekday at that. If we look at day a week with THC, it happens the same amount on every day of the week, whereas alcohol is very much a Friday, Saturday night thing. Number of contributing circumstances, this is kind of a crazy slide, so just look at the very bottom dark part of the bar. That's the proportion of these drivers that didn't have any contributing circumstances, as noted by the investigating officer. And if you look, alcohol typically is the lowest. Alcohol and THC is lower. Alcohol, THC, and drugs is the lowest. That doesn't have any contributing circumstances. But what's interesting, carboxy-THC looks like people that don't have drugs and alcohol in their system, probably because if you only have carboxy-THC in your system, you don't have alcohol or drugs in your system. Now this one is super fascinating. This is co-occurring high-risk factors, and we kind of pulled out the ones that are typically the offenders that go along with drug use and drinking. And that's distracted, and being unlicensed is kind of a socioeconomic indicator and high-risk use indicator that we kind of look at. And speeding. You see those three arms of speeding there at the end? That first one is alcohol only. That second one is THC and alcohol. That third arm, THC, alcohol, and drugs. So again, my message is it's the combination of marijuana and alcohol that not only have we seen an increase in, not even doing fancy statistics, just looking at the data shows us that that is a concerning trend. Those are scary people who are mixing alcohol and marijuana. This one cracks me up. This is the funniest slide because this slide shows that stoned drivers, or the drivers that had measurable THC in their blood, have a higher seatbelt use rate than people that don't use drugs and alcohol. They had the best seatbelt rate. And then, of course, same thing, and there's your alcohol on steroids again. Alcohol, about a third of them weren't buckled up, but you mix alcohol and THC, and you're up to 40% of those guys aren't wearing their seatbelts. And typically, in a fatal crash, if you wear your seatbelt, you're likely to survive. So if you're not wearing your seatbelt and you get in a really severe crash, you're going to die. And that's what we showed here. Okay, now this is interesting. Okay, so this goes back to the way that we used to look at this, which was all cannabinoids. Now we have this data that's detailed and allows us to look at the metabolite versus the delta-9 THC, or the impairing substance in marijuana when consumed. And look at that bold trend at the bottom where it says any delta-9 THC. Now recall that this also includes those that were mixed with drugs and alcohol. But this trend is incredible. We were down to, of all people testing positive for any marijuana, 44% in 2010. That went up in 2015. This was the only thing that changed. We're up to 90% of the drivers who are testing positive for marijuana are testing positive for delta-9 THC, which means they have recently used and then drove. So what's next? We are going to do some fancy statistics. We're going to do some fancy statistics on our sample size of 80, because that's where the fancy statistics should be done at this point. We're also going to look at the other types. So right now we have this information for occupants and non-motorists. We're going to go there and we're going to look at those guys as well. We're going to update our quarterly reports to start reporting marijuana the way it should be reported, which is delta-9 THC. We're going to continue to gather this toxicology data, and we're going to start linking it to other crash severities so we can do more research. And we have a lot of data users. You've already seen what AAA has done with our data. I don't have anybody from the University of Washington requesting this data, so of all the researchers in the room, do something fun, grab one of my business cards, call me, let me give you the data, and do some fun stuff with it. Okay?
Okay, I'm sure you don't have any questions after that one. I will be moderating those questions, so start writing them. Next up, I want to invite Dr. and Professor Therese Grant, a colleague of mine, and she's an epidemiologist who holds the Ann Streisguth Endowed Professorship in Fetal Alcohol Spectrum Disorders at the UW School of Medicine. She's also director of the UW Fetal Alcohol and Drug Unit, and she's the associate director of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, and a research affiliate with UW Center on Human Development and Disability. She's developed and directs the Washington State Parent-Child Assistance Program, so researcher and real world, my favorite, thank you very much. A multi-site evidence-based intervention working with pregnant and parenting mothers who have substance use disorders. She has published widely on intervention with high-risk mothers and their children and the effects of prenatal alcohol and drug exposure. I'm very happy to welcome Therese up here.
Thanks very much. It's really a pleasure to be here this afternoon with my great colleagues. So I'm talking about marijuana use during pregnancy, short and long-term effects. And it was really interesting to hear Rosalie Pakula this morning and also Stacy just now. There are a lot of problems with the quality of the research that's been done, lots of complications. So you'll be hearing a lot of the same refrain from me. So legal does not mean safe. That's what we know for sure about marijuana. The fact that marijuana use is now legal does not mean it's a safe drug, especially for pregnant women. As more and more states are considering legalization and more research is being done, there are a lot more questions that are beginning to arise about marijuana safety. So the health risks of marijuana are not the same for everyone. You know, they're different for teenagers, they're different for people of different ages, and certainly for pregnant women, because obviously not just the risk to the woman herself, but to the developing fetus and the potential for short and long-term effects. So first of all, does marijuana cross the placenta? So the placenta is the organ that nutrients and oxygen pass through the placenta to the baby. And yes, in fact, the THC, which is the main chemical component in marijuana, passes through the placenta very quickly. So THC can be detected in the mother's urine for weeks, and the amount depends, of course, on the potency, the frequency of use, the mother's metabolism, and the concentrations in the fetus are about a third of what are found in the mother. So how common is marijuana use during pregnancy? So the most recent national studies have found that, well, first of all, tobacco and alcohol are the most common drugs used during pregnancy. Marijuana is third. So among a sample of about 90,000 women nationally, 11% of pregnant women report using marijuana in the last year, and about 4% use in the past month. And among those moms who have used pregnant women who've used in the last year, 16% report that they use it almost daily. So here we go with the study design challenges. As I started reading the research on this, you get to the discussion section. Stacey, I had to laugh at your talk. It's like, yeah, really? Some of this stuff. So most pregnant women who use marijuana use other drugs, especially tobacco and alcohol. And tobacco and alcohol definitely have harmful effects on the fetus, and often long-term effects. And all of the studies agree it's very, very difficult to measure not only the marijuana exposure, but also to accurately measure the alcohol and tobacco. And, when you think about this, we've done a lot of studies on cocaine and alcohol and various things, but you're trying to measure exposure over a 9-month period, and it's almost always self-report. So, what did you use when, and how much did you use, at that time, and then you cut back later. So really trying to get an accurate exposure history is extremely hard, and then to try to control for that statistically. So the human and animal studies also have found that lifestyle factors have an effect as far as determining the effects on the fetus. So things like nutrition of the mother, her health status, and also social networks. I have a bias about alcohol because I'm a fetal alcohol syndrome researcher, but this was a nice piece of work done by the Academy of Pediatrics in 2013 comparing various agents and what their short and long-term effects are on the fetus. And by far, alcohol has the most permanent long-term damaging effects. Alcohol is actually a teratogen. That means it can cause permanent birth defects. Marijuana is not a teratogen. Nicotine is more harmful than marijuana. So just wanted to point that out. When we're looking at marijuana effects, we really are looking at how does that combine with alcohol and nicotine, which are very dangerous. So more study design challenges. Most of the studies have relied on maternal self-report, which may, of course, underestimate use. And most studies do not take potency into account. So most of the studies are yes, no, I used before pregnancy, yes, no, I used during pregnancy, or maybe at best they ask, did you use yes, no during the different trimesters? So THC levels are up to 7 times greater now than they were in the 1970s and 1980s. This was pretty interesting. This is some work that just came out of Colorado. It's not published yet, but Jones et al. Looked at meconium. So how many of you know what meconium is? Oh, good, okay. A lot of people don't. So meconium is it's fecal matter. It's the baby's first poop, basically. So it accumulates in the baby for months while the baby in utero, and it collects waste matter. So it's an excellent medium to look at for exposure during pregnancy. So Jones looked at meconium samples before legalization, before 2012, and then after 2014 in Colorado, and found that the percentage of meconium that was positive for THC didn't change very much after legalization. This was not a statistically significant increase. What was really fascinating was that among the exposed infants, the mean concentrations of THC in the meconium had gone up significantly. So something is happening in Colorado after legalization, whether, the production of it, whatever kind of marijuana the women are using, the THC is much stronger, and it showed up in this study, in the infant meconium. So that has some really serious implications. The babies are getting more THC. So what do we know so far about the effects of prenatal marijuana exposure? Stillbirth. This was a new study that came out recently by Varner. Surprised a lot of people. The risk for stillbirth among women who've used marijuana during pregnancy is 2.3 times higher than among women who didn't use. Now, just a cautionary note here, they weren't entirely sure that they controlled completely for tobacco, and tobacco also puts babies at risk for stillbirth. The other thing that's been pretty consistent is growth effects. So effects have been reported in numerous studies about decreased birth weight and small for gestational age, but this smallness doesn't persist throughout for many years after that. The findings, again, vary depending on the study design and whether other prenatal drug use was taken into account. Neurobehavior is another finding that's been pretty consistent. So most studies report some subtle effects on the baby's brain functioning as newborns, especially deficits in the baby's ability to regulate itself and also habituation. So habituation is a really important skill that newborns develop very quickly, and it means their ability to get accustomed to bright lights and noises and be able to ignore that. So it's babies that are exposed to marijuana have they have a much slower time developing habituation skills. They also have higher levels of irritability, excitability, increased startle response, and tremors, which would make sense. If babies aren't able to habituate and calm themselves, they are going to be more irritable. Sudden infant death syndrome has been looked at a lot, and so far there's no association, but a couple studies have found that there may be an effect of the dad's use, especially postnatally. The marijuana exposure by both the mother and the dad after the birth. A meta-analysis was just done in 2015. These people they looked at 881 titles and reduced those down to 24 studies that were really well done. And these 24 studies did not include women who had used other illegal drugs. So they did include marijuana or alcohol and tobacco, but not other drugs. So the summary of those studies found some increase in maternal anemia, and again, decrease in infant birth weight, and increase in the placement of newborns in the neonatal intensive care unit. Limitations were the same, as I've talked about, relying on self-report, and no information on potency or dose, timing, or frequency of the marijuana use. Possible long-term effects. There's been some work done on this. Paul Fried is the expert on this. He has found that prenatal marijuana exposure is associated at age 10 with deficits in behavioral functioning, especially attention, impulsivity, and subtle learning and memory problems. No apparent effect on overall IQ. The animal studies have found similar things. This is the thing that is worrying most people is by age 14, Fried has found deficits in executive functioning. So executive functioning is a higher order skill, neurologic process that includes our ability to organize, to take incoming information, to learn from our mistakes, to anticipate consequences, all of that. So prenatal marijuana exposure is associated with some kinds of deficit in EF by the age of 14 and not others. And why is that? It's because executive functioning is, the frontal lobes are responsible for executive functioning, and those lobes continue to develop, not just during pregnancy, but all the way up into adolescence. I think about this a lot, the quality of the relationship between mother and baby after the baby is born. So the ability to develop healthy emotional relationships, a baby learns from a mother by watching her and having the mother respond to the baby appropriately. And it's a two-way interaction. It's a back and forth, just beautiful thing that happens with mothers and babies. If the baby's, so it takes two people. So if the baby's neurologic system is impaired in any way by prenatal substance use, and on the other hand, if the mother's neurologic system is impaired by ongoing use, then the ability to form those attachments and pay attention and respond to those subtle cues is compromised. So it's just something to think about with a mother's ongoing marijuana use after the baby's born. Marijuana and breastfeeding. I'm kind of running out of time, but the picture tells the whole story. It's not, no, don't do this to me. So baby marijuana, THC is fat soluble. So that means it stays in the mother's fat cells. And if a mother smokes marijuana, the baby can keep getting that marijuana for that THC for a long time. They can show signs of sedation, reduced muscle tone, poor sucking. So the American Academy of Pediatrics definitely says women who use marijuana should not breastfeed. And there's no real way around that. Like women have for a long time figured out about drinking. Like if they want to go out and party, they can come back home and do what they call pump and dump, which means you can drink, you can come home, pump your breast milk, and throw it away, and you're not exposing the baby to it. But not so with marijuana because it's fat soluble. Accidental use of marijuana by children. Somebody mentioned this morning in Colorado. Again, Wang did a really good study, and he found that after marijuana was legalized, there was a significant increase in the number of kids under the age of 12 who were admitted to emergency rooms due to unintentional marijuana ingestion, mostly in the form of cookies and brownies and edibles. Most of the kids showed, there was no mortality, but most of them showed significant signs of central nervous system effects. So lethargy, drowsiness, unsteadiness, and half the kids were admitted to the hospital. So one of the things that I thought was pretty interesting about this study was that most of the children got their edibles from Grandma and Grandpa's house. Seriously, they were, so, the discussion, I noticed after I put that on there that the guy, he's not wearing any pants, and I didn't notice that until just recently. Anyway, so just back to the kind of unintended, things that you don't think about in a public health way. Often the use of the marijuana in these cases, it wasn't disclosed to the medical personnel in ER because Grandma and Grandpa were embarrassed about it, and there's stigma, even though marijuana is legal in Colorado. So it often the kids went through many unnecessary tests and procedures and a long time in the hospital before anybody said, oh, by the way, this is what happened, so this is what you should be looking at. So what we know, marijuana is not a safe drug to use during pregnancy. There's a number of potential health outcomes that have been identified. Studying prenatal marijuana effects is fraught with methodological challenges, assessing dose and exposure, controlling for other exposures. Self-report is problematic, but also biologic samples can be very problematic as well. Bea Carlini went to the New York Cannabis Science and Policy Summit just last month and was good enough to bring all these notes back. But there was a comment in there that that resonated with me when I was doing this talk, and it's that there's a presence of negatives in the absence of positives. So that's what we know about prenatal marijuana use. What we still need to know, most of the really fine research was done by great people, Ira Chasnoff, Claire Coles, Paul Freed, in the late 90s and in the early 2000s. And given what we know about the increasing potency of marijuana now, were the kids that were looked at in those earlier studies, were the findings from those studies underestimates of what we would see in today's world? I think it's a really important question. So, what we know is based on lower doses back years ago. So we need more studies. And almost all studies conclude there's a need for more and better research to fully describe the continuum effects on the kids over years of growth, and also a need for policymakers to be aware of the unintended consequences of new marijuana policies. So, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And our third and final speaker is Dr. Bea Carlini, who is a senior research scientist at the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute at the UW and an associate affiliate professor at the School of Public Health, which I can remember because I'm the exact same things. I can remember that. That helps me. That helps me remember. She's originally from Brazil and holds a doctorate in social psychology from the Catholic University of Sao Paulo and a Master of Public Health from the University of Washington. Her primary research interests are marijuana use, medicinal cannabis, and tobacco dependence. She is interested in testing brief interventions for substance use disorders using technology, and she has developed training programs for healthcare providers about smoking cessation, medicinal cannabis. If you haven't looked at the training online, you should, whether you are in the medical field or general public, and also other topics. And in 2016, she was appointed to coordinate ADAI's marijuana research activity, collaborate with other marijuana researchers at the UW, and liaison with policymakers in Washington State and researchers at other universities. So please welcome Bia.
So I'll be presenting some fresh out of the oven results on a study we conducted about helplines in the states that had legalized marijuana. So the first question is really why study helplines? As some of you may know or may have tried, when you have a question and you really don't know what to do, you go to Dr. Google. And Dr. Google answer all your questions. So if you type there like cannabis problems help or drug use help or something, you're gonna get helplines. In the old times, that was in the yellow pages. Not of you are gonna remember that, but there was a book called Phone Book, and there was yellow pages, and that's where you find the helplines. These days, it's more Dr. Google that helps you out on that. So the helplines are, in fact, for many, many people, the first contact, the first impression you have when you are moving towards wanting to do something about behavior you may want to modify. It's really a bridge between community and possible hook with treatment agencies. Historically, drug helplines is not every helpline, but traditionally they come from a model of crisis, of really helping moments of crisis, typically from it's a development separate from, but coming from suicide helplines. And with that, they use very much the same model. Is anonymous, is 24/7, has that sense of a peer model, so you've been there so you can help. In case of substance abuse, a lot of people that staff or are volunteers are people that are in recovery from substance abuse, and therefore embrace typically that idea that you have the AA or NA model, that you have to be abstinence completely. That's the only way you could possibly manage your problem. Also, typically of this model is not collecting systematic data. It's a crisis model where data is not entered in the system in a systematic way. Some data is collected, but it's not collected in detail. Our research questions on trying to understand the helplines were two. First, are they able to provide evidence-based information related to marijuana? Was conducting states where marijuana was legalized, and are they, with this model of recovery, able to and willing to meet callers where they are, in terms of if they are not willing to contemplate going to a drug rehab and giving up in marijuana the whole life, are they able to at least contemplate a possibility? And these are the names of the 4 helplines we study. We use the secret shopper method. So many of you must be familiar with this. Is what companies, watchdog organizations do all the time. They get somebody to be a mystery or a secret customer, or utilize our services and make questions and therefore collect data about the quality of service that is provided and analyze that. The academic research is not as common. It's a method that has been increasing with time, but it's not very common to do this method. If you look there is 36 articles in PubMed with all different kinds of topics being looked. In our case here, we did our work with 2 secret shoppers, one a woman, another man. We did a total of 11 calls. We got exempt, submitted and got exemption from IRB, Institutional Review Board. We had a very tight timeline, so we wanted to go fast, in 3 months, do everything. So we committed on not recording the calls. We took copious notes, so really That way, the responder in the helpline couldn't be identified, and all the data presented here is presented in total without identifying quit line per quit line. Was a qualitative pilot study where we basically saw the most important themes and the responses within each team. I can elaborate more as needed. So the secret caller. So it was a dude that called the helpline. Important to remember, it could be a dudette too, because there was women calling. And they are calling to say, hey, I've been using marijuana for a long, long time, decades actually, but I increased my use substantially lately. I'm smoking every day. I used to smoke only the weekend. And I think it's related to the store that just opened around the corner of my home. It's been very convenient for me to get. And I actually been driving now, and that's really what got me scared. I have a job, I'm not that kind of person. I don't drive intoxicated, and I did that last week. So this person says to the staff or volunteer in the helpline, I wanted to talk things over with you. I'm not really wanting to stop, use marijuana. I just wanted to go back what I was before. I have been doing this for many, many years, and I'm really not interested in drug addiction treatment. That's not me. And we let then the person in the helpline to respond and elaborate about that situation. And then after a while, the dude has two bright ideas that they want to share with the helpline and said, well, one idea is do you think if I start using edibles or vaporizing, it's going to get better? It helps me to decrease my use. And the other question was, I had this other idea. What about if I start using so much THC and get lower THC or maybe more CBD in the weed I buy? So then we also see what kind of response we got. So our findings had a mix, some good, some not so good, as everything in life. What was very interesting was to see the consistency across the 4 states. Although we are not identifying state by state, they were very consistent. We found very similar things. It's, in qualitative research, you look for saturation. We had saturation like even before the 11 calls. It was very interesting to see. What we found that was good was that, in fact, the helplines were able to meet the callers where they are at. So 10 out of the 11 calls, the moderation goal was not challenged, and the moderation goal was considered in referral. So example of things that were said, you can see here, like even if they were embracing 12-step themselves, to be honest, I'm recovering myself, and for me, 12-step was what worked, but it's always an option for you to cut back. In terms of referrals, they did the best they could. They were paying attention to the moderation goal, and in the states that had a harm reduction agency and the person on the phone was aware of them, they directly recommend a harm reduction agency. In many cases, they recommended Marijuana Anonymous, what we had scripted already. Oh, but don't I have then to be, totally abstinent to use it, to go there? And they said, well, just pretend you are. You don't have to say anything. Go there and listen. So you could really say them trying to make an offer to offer support, but not to say that their goal was not valid. So try that, and some also suggested counseling. Also good was seeing truly and genuine empathy and no judgment. Instead of saying, are you kidding, you smoke weed and when driving? Nobody said that. It's like, oh, sounds like you understand that you did was dangerous. Always this, does that seem like a good thing? And a really, truly genuine intention to help and not to make judgments. The not so good was very limited knowledge. When it came to CBD, vaporizer, then you start seeing over and over and over, I don't know, I have no idea, I never was trained in that, so we got one that was the most comprehensive answer on the 100% of the calls we did. Also, concerning, I think, it was that they were really, really trusting the stores with the answers they didn't have, which seems like a little concerning maybe because they are selling the product, they wanted to cut down, so just a thought here. But that was another thing we heard, and in two cases, but amplifying this could be concerned. People really, truly trying to help, but without information, say, well, vaporizer is stronger than flour. Well, vaporizer is a means to use it, and flour is a product, and then they put hash oil in the middle. They were really confused and struggling to understand, or giving information that edibles would be the best one to really know your dose when it's exactly the opposite. It's exactly the most hard way to use and titrate. So in this study, basically, we are seeing the good things of not having a judgment approach to marijuana use and being willing to go beyond recovery, but also concerning issues about lack of marijuana knowledge, and also, you can refer as much, you have good places to refer. Some implications of this in Washington State, and I'm sure many of you are aware that I-502 was approved with the spirit to also offer support with the taxes generated, and it was, in fact, called for a specific marijuana public health line with the characteristics we just did our study on. And the way that it was interpreted by the law here, not by the people, by policymakers, is, well, let's give money to the helpline we already have. Wasn't exactly that the law, but that was the interpretation. And here you have the Department of Health's budget for 2016 is in the order of $6 million. And if you cannot see how much was given for the marijuana helpline, squint your eye a little bit, maybe like here. Yeah, here. See it? So that was $35,000 out of the money. So don't get me started on that. I just want to remind us that these are the money for the adults that are parents of our kids. They are the bus drivers on school buses. They are the nannies. They are the dentists. They are the adults in the neighborhood. So, and by the way, they are generating all this money. 100% of this money you are seeing here. Just to conclude, so what do we know? And based on, really the first study that you do in helplines that in states that are legalized, we know that helplines play an important role in linking people to services. They have empathic and supportive staff. The service model is a barrier to data collection, and data collection is not just interesting for researchers. They really can inform policy and public health measures. And at this point in time, helplines are not prepared to deliver evidence-based and research-based information to minimize the harms associated with marijuana use among adults. What do we need to know is it possible to change? Is it possible to leverage traditional helplines to do a different job? If we were to continue to use, at least in Washington State, the model that the money comes to the current recovery line. So can traditional helplines really provide evidence-based services and be a public health sentinel in a way that really detecting the trends and collect better data to the marijuana use and associated problems? And what I think is also a very important question, and it was in the spirit of the law before, are like the dude that call, is he okay to call a recovery helpline that is marketed and identified with the traditional model of drug addiction if maybe he would like to see something more related to what he considers his profile? It's the famous saying that, if you get a tobacco user and is a substance use and dependence as any other, would they be comfortable calling a line that is for other substances? We know we are not. So, tobacco users have a separate line. So thank you very much, and that's it.
We'll go through the questions we have here. And I have a couple questions. One observation that was just interesting to me, and I know that it was a sample size of 2 in some ways, but was that we saw an increase in driving in terms of the proportion of those who had any cannabinoid present actually being THC versus just the metabolite. That went from 44% to 90%, I think, over just 5 or 6 years. And the concentration of meconium also went up, even as the actual total amount of use didn't increase. We saw the same thing in some work that I did around impaired driving in Washington State, where the proportion of folks who went up in terms of DUI cases that had marijuana present, that also corresponded very closely with increased law enforcement presence and training to detect that. What is interesting there is also the median value, the median level of THC in the blood increased from 4 to 5.5 nanograms over that same period, also a significant difference. So I think it's something we're seeing over and over again, and whether it's at the population level or at the individual level, is trying to get a sense of, are we seeing more people using, are people using kind of more often or in more hazardous ways? Really difficult things to answer because we really generally don't have the historical data to tease that apart. But something seems to be changing pretty profoundly in how marijuana is getting used and how much that is people are using more closely to the time they're engaging in some behavior, which is maybe could be what driving is indicating, or perhaps what could also be driving it is just a more potent product. That would apply to both of those findings, I think. So I wanted to, I'm going to sort of go through this linearly as best I can, which people know is not my forte, but I will do my best. So one of the things I wanted to ask, I had a couple questions for Stacy. You talked about motor vehicle crashes, and I'm wondering how much there's a role for the marijuana, sort of that independent marijuana. So as people saw that, there's one thing to say there's cannabinoids present, there's another thing to say there's THC present, it's another thing to say there's THC above a certain level present. Is there any relationship between that and actually being a causing driver versus being in an incident?
And that we don't know yet. So those 80 drivers that had THC only, as you saw with alcohol, we've kind of established that, but also just being an indicator of being a single vehicle crash is pretty obvious, like who's at fault. Well, 3 and 4 of these crashes that involved a THC driver involved other vehicles, so we're not actually sure who's at fault. So we're doing some research later this year with the Washington State University. Can I say that? Washington State University. They're going to take those 80 case files and take a qualitative approach at the data rather than quantitative, which is what we typically see and is incredibly difficult to assign culpability in that manner. So not only are they going to assign culpability, maybe we'll do some matching and some comparisons and try to derive some level of crash risk based on marijuana alone and see what we come up with.
One of the questions that came from the audience was, were the data used historically for identifying marijuana in drivers the same tests as used now? So that's a question about the actual testing methodology. And I guess I will add to that and ask about only 60%. I know that's a high proportion, but still 40% are not being assessed, which means there's a possibility for inconsistency over time and bias. So is there a change in the actual tests that are used themselves? And also, have you done any analysis to look at, is that 60% a consistent 60% over time? Are there certain types of cases that we're not seeing that are higher or lower severity?
Yeah, and you can probably talk to the changes at the lab better than I can. So the one that I know the best of, there's always changes with changes in lab equipment. So the Traffic Safety Commission did purchase a piece of equipment for the toxicology lab that allowed them to lower their threshold for testing. Prior to 2013, the cutoff level for THC was 2 nanograms, and well, it was 1, and then it was 2, and then with 502 at 2013, it went back down to 1. So there has been some minor changes, though, but I think you found that was not a high effect on the population. Looking at deceased drivers versus surviving drivers, there are some differences. Approximately 90% of deceased drivers are tested, and that's because of that RCW. Surviving drivers are 35%, so the 60% comes with a combination of those two. So actually among surviving drivers, it's lower, and there's several reasons that it's lower. You could be surviving but still incredibly injured. So that, of course, is the first priority at the scene, is to stabilize and get you to the hospital. Sometimes by the time we get the blood, it doesn't matter because too much time has passed. The other piece of it is important, is that it's not about what you're using or what's in your blood. It's about impairment. And officers in this state need to have reasonable cause to suspect impairment before they get a warrant to draw your blood. However, that has been really consistent over time. It's always been approximately 35% of surviving drivers, 90% of deceased drivers. So I would say not a lot has changed in terms of being able to compare those across years in the fatal crash data.
Okay. And I'll just mention for folks as well, as Therese said, that you actually don't really particularly care what the blood level is of THC. What you care about is the fat level, which is what your brain is made out of, which we don't generally test at a roadside testing procedure. But the problem is we're stuck with this sort of imperfect measurement of the actual presence of THC in the fluid that we don't particularly care about. So, but it's convenient. On that topic, I will just mention, since the per se impairment standards, and I remind people, just like for blood alcohol, having a blood level of 0.08 is a per se indication of intoxication, of impairment, that can be used in court proceedings. We have a 5 nanogram per milliliter per se level for THC. Oregon does not. Other states do not. So the question is about AAA Foundation in both interpreting my work and the data coming out of Stacy's lab is essentially saying per se is no good. It doesn't account for tolerance. Our time to blood testing is so long. Is there a point at which, and this is a question to you, I don't know if you feel comfortable answering it or not, is essentially will those per se levels be challenged in court since the evidence is pretty weak on them?
I get questions about court all the time, and I don't go to court, thank God. So I can't speak too much about what happens in the courtroom, but what we need anytime there's something like this, it needs to go to court and it needs to be tested. And right now, I do know that the emphasis is still on the impairment and not the blood test. And that's going to be even more strong as more and more research comes out and says exactly what we already know, that there is no sweet spot per se for marijuana. It's better, I think sometimes when I present, I underestimate the effect of marijuana, and I just want to reiterate that it is an impairing substance, and you should not drive under the influence of marijuana. However, you can also be way over 5 nanograms and not be impaired to the point where you can't drive, and you can be under and be impaired to the point that you cannot drive. So law enforcement will agree with me that the focus has always been on impairment, and the focus will remain on impairment.
Great, thank you. A couple of questions here for Therese. So one of these, the question is about stillbirth data, and growth data suggests that smoked marijuana is an issue. And I'm wondering if you actually know if it's actually cannabis consumption via whatever route, or is it perhaps actually the smoking component?
That's a really good question, and the studies don't address that.
And folks may be aware that in general, it looks like there's an increasing move to more edible consumption on average in the population. So do you have anything on comment on it? Okay.
Yeah, no.
Okay. And then also sort of a study design question, my favorite. In a 10-year study looking at attention deficit disorder, did they rule out sort of whether environmental or social nurturing effects, looking at ADD?
The Paul Fried study did, actually, I don't recall, what that study controlled for, so,
Good.
sorry.
Okay. And I think I'm going to wait on these other 2 questions. I think you actually addressed them pretty well in your topic. I'll come back to them if we have time. And then, a couple questions for you, Bia. Given the lack of tax funds going to sort of treatment-oriented helplines, is it possible Washington will refer to web treatment or apps that they might buy? And I guess sort of what do you think about, what is out there? What do you think about those? And is that a reasonable substitute or solution?
Yeah, I think apps and web-based interventions are becoming more and more popular, are being tested. Some of them show good results and efficacy on treating. But I think we have to keep in mind that there is no one size fits all. People vary a lot in terms of what they feel comfortable with, how they engage, from cultural issues to level of literacy to age group. I don't think we have to choose. I think with the money that is being generated, we can have it all, and you need to have it all. So I wouldn't choose one. You have technology with way more reach and lower efficacy, and then you have treatments that have way more efficacy but with lower reach, like going weekly on a place. So we need it all. By the way, in our website, learnaboutmarijuana.org, if you go there, you're going to see web-based testing randomized trials that Australians put together. Is a 6-section using cognitive behavior therapy called Reduce Your Use. That is exactly for people that first are fine using web treatment, is interactive, and second, don't mind Australian accent, and third, are interested in reducing their using, or maybe, of course, just stopping using altogether is always a very important and the ideal goal.
This question is about, since it sounds like the stores are seen as a source of information, is it possible to actually build on that and essentially build knowledge and effectively share it through those venues? And I guess my question as well is, how much do you think there are good educational materials that are written appropriately that convey adequate harm reduction information for folks so they can make informed decisions?
Yeah, so the whole thing about the stores being a site for getting information, yeah, of course. I don't think there is necessarily, as a setting, a problem with that. But there is a very reasonable assumption that when you have a for-profit organization with the purpose to sell its product, there was some reasonable concern that the information given there may have some bias towards using it. So that has to be kept in mind. That being said, having information at the point of sale produced by organizations that are not in the selling business is a very, very important thing, and I would strongly recommend and incentivize that these materials are produced. We have some materials that I think you would reach to this public. Again, going to our website, learnaboutmarijuanawa.org, you have a tab called Adult Consumers, and this comes from a harm reduction perspective, just being saying, well, you're here in the store, probably there's no point to say, do you want to use? Well, it's already in the store. So, and it's adult user, so they can at least read some things that made them think that, maybe, using concentrates might be a little more, they can think about it. They can, so this material should be available, and I hope consent, ethical owners, and there are many of them out there, would be willing to think about producing them more.
Can I add a little bit to that too? Prevention versus responsible use, I think, touches each one of our areas that we focus on. And in traffic safety, it's about responsible use. And when I am consulting with other states facing the legalized ballot this next year, I often say, don't overlook your marijuana community as potential partnerships. And one of the best marketing materials I've ever seen so far was a pack of rolling papers that one of the dispensaries or retail stores were giving away. And it had a picture of a car on it. And when you took one of those papers and rolled it into a joint, it showed a crashed up car. And I just thought, I don't even know how they did that, but it just was neat. So it's those kinds of things that if at least your focus is responsible use, there's a huge potential for partnership with that private market.
So I'm going to try to synthesize several of these last questions, and it is very interesting as we're talking about harm reduction and controlled use, and I think that we kind of get that in the driving context, and we certainly there's been education around that, around alcohol for decades. I'm getting, essentially, to summarize this, essentially a sense of discomfort for that around pregnancy and breastfeeding, that essentially the summary is really you shouldn't be using. And I think trying to figure out, is there something in between there? Is there anything that's really, from a harm reduction standpoint, I guess maybe separating two phases. One is around pregnancy and the other is around breastfeeding, because the breastfeeding seemed pretty clear. You were really saying you should not be breastfeeding at any point while smoking marijuana or consuming marijuana, cannabis products, partially because of the long half-life and it's fat soluble. I guess just how would you respond to that, the fact that, what would harm reduction look like for people who do want to continue using marijuana during pregnancy or breastfeeding? Well,
I think that's a good question, and I think about that a lot with alcohol as well. For the message for using during pregnancy, that my message and the thing that medical doctors are centering around now is that the science is complicated, or the science is undone, it's unfinished. But the public health message is clear. So we don't want to deceive women about risks that may not actually be there. That's what happened with the cocaine epidemic and the fear of neurologic time bombs, these kids that would be in our classrooms, and that turned out to not be true. We don't want to do that with marijuana. But nevertheless, I think it's fair to tell women that the science is not complete and it's inconclusive. But public health-wise, the way to have the healthiest baby possible is to not use marijuana or alcohol or tobacco during pregnancy. So it's just pretty straightforward. One of the other issues is talking to physicians about this. And we have the same thing with alcohol. How many doctors are willing to ask women about alcohol and then advise them not to use? A lot of doctors don't even want to go there because they don't know what to say. You know, like if she is a heavy user, should he refer her to treatment, and does treatment really work? If she is using, does he need to report her to child welfare services? You know, these are all good questions. So a lot of times doctors would rather not ask. But the message is the less you can use, the better during pregnancy.
Okay, we'll wrap up there. Thank you all very, very much. Appreciate it.
So again, as you heard earlier in the day, there had been a focus on the policies as they impact on public health, but also there were the comments along the way about the impact of policy on prevention and intervention. And so this afternoon's speakers in the panel will really focus on that aspect of it. So what we would like to do is to have the opportunity to have actually a number of the folks who are here from the University of Washington who have been doing research in these areas to talk about those. And I'm going to introduce, I am the moderator, so I am who I am. I've been that way since this morning. I'm still Dennis Donovan. I'm still the director, I think, of the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, depending on how you see this thing going. And I'm also, I'm aware that there are some people who have commented about my puns, which is typical for the presentation. And in fact, you know, given the focus again of the marijuana, that it could give me an edible complex. So Ron Jackson, how did I do? All right. Okay. So the first of our presenters is going to be Dr. Kevin Haggerty, and we're pleased to have Kevin with us. He is the director of the Social Development Research Group and has been involved actively and intensively in a variety of projects across time that have focused on community-level interventions to help facilitate the prevention of substance use, initiation and/or reduction if initiated. And one of the areas that, in fact, the university, both SDRG as well as the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, have been asked to do as part of the I-502 funding is to focus on trying to define what represent evidence-based prevention programs, and then later on in the presentations, evidence-based intervention programs. So Kevin is going to talk today about the process in which there's been an evaluation of prevention programs having to do with marijuana, and to talk about that outcome. So he's looking at me as if, is that what I'm supposed to be talking about? So, yeah. So Kevin, come talk about whatever it is you had planned.
Thanks, Dennis. Just delightful to be here at the Marijuana Symposium. I am glad to be talking a little bit about marijuana use prevention programs in Washington State. And you'll see that beautiful picture of Mount Rainier there, and there's a reason for that. And the reason is that I've been recently presenting with folks from the state of Colorado. And whenever you present with the people of Colorado, they always have these beautiful images of mountains all over, like they own the mountains. And I think, that's a big mountain. That's bigger than anything you got. So I decided to start putting that at the front of my presentations when I'm presenting with Colorado. But just to kind of put this in context, I have to give credit to my colleagues at Washington State University, particularly Brittany Rhodes Cooper and other doctoral students there who assisted with this work, along with Julia Havens, Washington State Department of Behavioral Health and Recovery, and the folks there really who are working on defining the evidence-based programs that would be eligible for DBHR funding. So I want to just talk a little bit. We were asked to kind of talk about what do we know and what don't we know. And so here's what I think we know. I think we know that I-502 provides money or resources for evidence-based prevention programs. And that's really important. There's two really important things there, evidence-based and money or resources. So those are two really important things. I-502, when it was written, there was a real sense that we had to make sure that if we were going to legalize marijuana, we needed to protect or buffer the effects of legalization on those most vulnerable. So there was an accommodation to allow for funding for prevention programming in the I-502 initiative. The second thing is that programs have been tested and have been shown to have specific impacts on marijuana. So there are a set of programs, there are 13 of them that have had marijuana-specific outcomes, and that's a good thing, so we can point directly to some programs that have an evidence of marijuana specificity. The third thing is that there are underlying risks for marijuana misuse. And we know what those underlying risk factors are. We can move upstream and we can make a difference in reducing the underlying risk factors. The fourth thing is programs have had impacts on reducing those underlying risk factors early on. So we can make a difference even before middle school and high school. And then finally, regulation of the industry is critically important to prevention. And I hope, I wasn't here this morning during the keynote, but I'm sure that regulation was an issue that emerged from the comments this morning. And I think when we talk about what we don't know, this will be an important next step for us. But let's talk about what we do know. I don't know if any of you read the Seattle Times. People don't usually read the paper anymore. But on Monday or Tuesday this week, there was a great editorial that highlighted the fact that the legislature is not actually providing resources in the way I-502 was written. And if you see here in the orange, you can see what the spending actually is. And in the green, you can see what I-502 promised. And there's a difference between what the spending is. On the right side, you can see prevention, treatment, and education. In what I-502 promised was about $42.8 million, and what we're seeing is about $20.9 in prevention and treatment. Go across to 2018 as we see increases, and we see that there's $39.7 million projected for spending and $86.3, which I-502 suggested. We do need, and the intent of I-502 was to fund prevention efforts and treatment efforts so that we could buffer or mitigate the consequences or the potential consequences of legalization. It's really important for us to ensure that we have the resources we need both to provide prevention and treatment. And the other thing the editorial identified was that there does need to be revenues for research around this for the universities to conduct research related to marijuana. So both of those are things I think that are really important. And the Marijuana Fund in Washington State suggests that at least 85% must be directed to evidence-based and cost-beneficial programs and practices that produce objectively measurable results. So of the money that's allotted to prevention and that those need to be evidence-based programs. So how do we account for what's evidence-based? How do we know what programs would be eligible for this money that both are evidence-based and cost-beneficial? Now, the legislature and DBHR in their wisdom pushed the cost-beneficial up to 2020 so that we had time to get to that place where we could really evaluate the cost-benefit of some of these programs. But one of the things we have to do is look at what are the underlying factors and what are the underlying conditions that contribute to marijuana abuse. And this is really hard for people to see, but there are risk factors in the community, the school, the family, and the individual peer group that contribute to marijuana misuse. And there's a chapter that's in press right now that reviews those risk factors in Contemporary Issues on Marijuana And also, there's a new article by Harap and Catalano 2016 that looks at substance abuse risk factors and evidence-based programs. The important thing here is you see a convergence of all of the risk factors pretty much related to marijuana misuse. And you can see that there's an overlap between those and substance abuse, delinquency, teen pregnancy, school dropout, violence, depression, and anxiety. There's a crossover between those underlying factors and and marijuana misuse. So if you look at family, for example, in the top 3, family history of the problem behavior, family management problems that consist of lack of clear guidelines, inconsistent monitoring, and inconsistent consequences, contribute to all of those problem behaviors, as well as family conflict. So if you're working on family issues, you're really working on preventing all of those problem behaviors. So early family management, early family issues might be a really important area to focus on. We also know that our work at SDRG has shown that peer or sibling use, prior alcohol use, and prior cigarette use increase marijuana initiation, and that good family management, norms against use, and perceived harm decrease family or marijuana initiation. So we know that there are particular areas that we would want to focus on in those evidence-based programs. And there's also a set of protective factors that we've organized into what we call the social development model or the social development strategy that work to protect young people from initiation into drug use. And it's kind of as simple as 5 fingers on your hand, that there are 5 key elements that protect young people: opportunities for meaningful involvement, skills for those meaningful involvements, and recognition coming from effort and achievement from those involvements. Opportunities, skills, recognition. When you have those 3 elements, that promotes a stronger bond of attachment or connection. That strong bond motivates people to follow the clear standards of behavior at the family, the school, and the community level, and we're more likely to see following that and having healthy behaviors. So it's important that we know that there's underlying risk factors and protective factors, and those need to be addressed in the evidence-based programs that we're looking at supporting with the Marijuana Fund. So the question we have is, what programs are supported by Washington State DBHR and the Marijuana Fund for marijuana resources? And again, with the collaborators at WSU and DBHR, we've kind of gone through this 5-step process where we first looked at what's the preliminary list of youth marijuana use outcomes and what programs have specific marijuana outcomes. So we also looked at Washington State Institute for Public Policy. We looked at risk factor path analyses. And we looked at the second-tier programs to move upstream and do those underlying programs, and have made a final list of determinants of the types of programs that are available. The first 13 that were specified that are related to specific marijuana outcomes include family programs, guiding good choices, and positive family checkup. School programs included the Caring School Community, Keeping It Real, Life Skills Training, Lions Quest, Toward No Drug Abuse, Red Cliff Wellness, Individual, In Shape, Sport, Multidimensional Treatment Foster Care, Project Northland, and Project Venture in the Community. Now, not all of these are available, and that's another problem with that. These all had marijuana-specific outcomes. So, for example, here you see Life Skills Training having a significant impact on marijuana use 1 year later at post-test and 1 year later, as well as polydrug use. So the Washington State Institute for Public Policy also was looking at the cost-benefit of those programs. It's hard for you to see these, but you see a lot of the green showing a cost-benefit, but you get down to the bottom, and some of the programs did not have a cost-benefit, so they would not be eligible for those programs. But it seemed like the programs that I just mentioned here, those are all coming in pretty late in the game. middle school and high school. And we talked about, isn't there something we should be doing earlier to address those underlying factors that would be eligible for the marijuana funds? So Grace Hong and her colleagues did a path analysis, really observing what some of the underlying factors are directly related to marijuana use, either through peer and individual drug use or directly to drug use, and found that family factors, a family general index and family drug-specific factors and peer factors were directly related to later marijuana use. So we did a second tier of program reviews looking at NREP and blueprints to determine which ones met those criteria. And we looked on NREP at the overall quality of the research that had a 3 or higher in most areas to be eligible. And what we found is that we needed to have some clear criteria that included they've already demonstrated marijuana outcomes, they have an impact on earlier risk or protective factors, demonstrating outcomes on multiple risk factors, especially attitudes and intentions. It's consistent with the blueprints criteria of strong rigor and include more than a pre-post test to be included. We wanted to make sure there were no iatrogenic or negative effects, especially related to marijuana use, and that it was independently evaluated rather than as a part of a booster or part of a system. And we stayed focused on marijuana rather than alcohol or tobacco-specific programs. So here you see family programs. I won't read all of these, but these are the family programs. The ones in blue also are on the blueprints list for healthy development. And definitely Nurse-Family Partnership, Incredible Years, move upstream and provide early programming for families. In the endorsed school behaviors, there were some that emerged for early upstream, including good behavior game, positive action, coping power, raising healthy children, even keeping it real earlier on. And you can see that these provide more options for communities for prevention programming. And there's some community-level programs that included Communities That Care, Prosper, Project Northland, STAR, and mentoring for students that's community-based. And DBHR also really felt it was important to include some environmental strategies, and these included policy review and development, purchase surveys, along with reward and reminder, so kind of secret shopper type at stores, restrictions on community events like, are we going to have Uncle Ike sponsor the block party on Capitol Hill? So are there restrictions on those kinds of things? And social norms marketing. So there are some things that we don't know. Those are the programs that we're saying, yeah, they have a good impact or potentially good impact, but here's what we don't know. Although they've had an impact on marijuana-specific behaviors or on early risk factors, none of these have been tested in the context of legalized marijuana. So it's really important now that we do research on these programs in the context of legalized marijuana. So life skills training has been tested, has marijuana-specific outcomes, but it's never been tested in the context of legal marijuana use. It's an important thing that we have to do in Washington State. We don't know what the cost is of moderate marijuana use. When we look at costs, we look at costs of heavy marijuana use. But what are the costs of moderate marijuana use? Are they big? Are they something that we need to pay attention to? We also don't know the impact of increased parental drug use, or marijuana use specifically, in proximity to children during different developmental ages. So right now, we're not seeing this big spike in marijuana use amongst 10th and 12th graders, but we are seeing, but those people have pretty much defined their peer group and decided how life is gonna go. But it's the 6-year-olds right now whose parents are using in front of them and are gonna develop a peer network of potential users in 5 or 10 years that I think I have more concern about. We also are unclear about the causal pathways of risk and protective factors, and we need to be clear about that specific to marijuana use, and we're doing work to help understand those pathways much better. There are a couple other really important things we don't know yet. What will the legislature do with the marijuana fund? And this is a really important thing because we all have to be information givers to our legislators to let them know that this is what we voted on and this is what we want sustained. Providing information to our legislators is an important thing that we should be doing. The other thing we don't know is what industry will do to reduce regulation. And we can bet that industry will move forward to reduce sign restrictions, for example, or distance to where kids are gathering. Those are already beginning to erode, and we need to hold strong on a strong regulatory policy around marijuana outlets. So that's a little bit about what we know, what the evidence is showing right now around the programs for DBHR, and some important things that we don't yet know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kevin. I think I'm supposed to do that. So our next speaker is going to really provide us with a focus on what is it that will elicit an individual seeking treatment or seeking some kind of input, either in a rehabilitative treatment approach or, as had been talked about previously, in a harm reduction approach. The speaker is Dr. Denise Walker, who is a research associate professor in the School of Social Work and the director of the Innovative Research Programs. Did I get it right? I didn't. I'll get it right. Innovative Programs Research Group. So Denise is also a licensed clinical psychologist, and her work has really been looking over the past number of years at the way in which to use cognitive behavioral motivational interviewing approaches to try to address behavior change in a variety of different areas of function. But most importantly, over the recent past and relevant to the presentation today, is the development, along with Roger Rothman and Rob Stevens, the checkup approach. So it's been developed initially with adolescents, it's been used with adults, and it's really a very different approach than oftentimes is seen in a preventive, almost a self-seeking, treatment-seeking approach to try to reduce the use of marijuana in these different populations. So, Denise?
So I do treatment research, but also brief intervention research with the checkup model. And we're conducting a study right now, actually. So if you know anybody who's struggling with marijuana problems and also uses tobacco, feel free to give us a call. We're accepting people who are interested in free treatment. But here today, I'm interested in talking about people or interventions to elicit self-referral. The thing about that is that for treatment, the type of person who actually walks in your door to voluntarily present for treatment for substance abuse is a rare and exotic gem, sort of like a unicorn. Maybe more akin to a four-leaf clover or a Sasquatch, because we know those two things really do exist. But pretty much, the far majority of folks who are struggling with a substance use disorder or could be characterized as having a substance abuse disorder in the United States are not seeking treatment. So of the 22.7 million people in the United States who have a substance use disorder, 10% are actually receiving treatment or have received treatment in the past year. And if you think pie is as delicious as I do, you want a piece of that bigger part. Why don't people seek treatment? Well, for some, it's the acceptance of a pretty derogatory label. Who wants any of these kind of terms associated with them? We know that substance abuse continues to be a pretty highly stigmatized behavior. And then there are a lot of practical barriers, too. People have questions about where they can turn for services and what it might be like to be in treatment. So how do I find a provider? How much does it cost? What will I do for childcare? How long is treatment? Will they make me sit in a group holding hands, singing Kumbaya? All reasonable questions that people have who are contemplating treatment. But I think one of the biggest reasons that people don't seek treatment is that there is a huge amount of ambivalence associated with their use. And again, the far majority of folks who are not receiving treatment don't even perceive the need for it. So they're not seeing themselves as a person that's a good match for whatever concept they have for treatment. And then, of course, we know rehab is for quitters, right? So by nature, treatment facilities are a very poor match for people who are ambivalent or contemplating change rather than completely ready and ready to go as far as action goes and changing their problem. And also, I think people sometimes worry that non-abstinence goals will not be accepted within treatment. So for all of these reasons, I think the challenge really exists that we need to be developing interventions that reach that far majority of substance users who are not walking into our doors for treatment. So these interventions need to reach more people, they need to increase motivation to change, and they need to encourage treatment entry when appropriate. We know that there are a number of different early intervention strategies that are trying to fill this gap, but most of them really operate in opportunistic settings, such as primary care or the juvenile justice system, or target working through family members to target individuals to motivate them to enter treatment. Very few actually target the substance user themselves to elicit self-referral into a treatment program or into a conversation that could think about change. So that's where the checkup model comes in. The checkup model is all about the design of really focusing on that far majority of substance users who are not in treatment, not seeking treatment, maybe don't even identify as needing treatment, but they're contemplating maybe change or the effect the substances are having on their body, on their life, on their goals. It's designed to enhance commitment to change, and it includes three main things. First, it includes an advertisement strategy. You need to get these people interested in calling and self-referring, and it needs to be a program that they're interested in taking that step towards. The program itself includes an assessment of that behavior, whatever it is, and the risk factors that are associated with it. And then the intervention itself is a variant of motivational enhancement therapy, typically between 1 and 4 sessions, depending on the intervention. So again, the checkup model really is trying to think about those barriers that were described at the beginning and really knock them down. It's focusing on attracting self-referral from people who aren't seeking treatment, and it's non-judgmental, it's an individualized, personalized session, confidential or anonymous. It's advertised as an opportunity to talk, not as treatment specifically. And a motivational enhancement therapy framework is a great tool and intervention for this kind of work because it meets the person where they're at. And it's very accepting of different stages of change and levels of motivation. Motivational enhancement therapy more generally and within this intervention includes, it can vary in length. For delivery, it's usually done in person, but we've adapted checkups for the phone, and others have looked at it for the computer. It uses a motivational interviewing style throughout, so the counselor relies on open-ended questions and reflective listening to really draw out the individual's motivation for themselves. Motivational enhancement therapy by nature includes personalized feedback, and so a personalized feedback report is reviewed with the participant and covers their behavior, compares their behavior with others in their age group or similar to them, and reviews risk factors associated with their use. And the principle that dominates it is really just to facilitate that candid exploration of a person's use or risky behavior, and to include a conversation around the costs and benefits of change and of using, comparing their use with others, and also thinking about and considering the impact that their use has on important things such as relationships and their goals. So we have been involved in a number of checkup applications to a number of different populations for highly stigmatized behaviors. But the drinker's checkup was the original intervention developed at the University of New Mexico by Bill Miller, and that has taken on a few iterations. It's been computerized now and also offered over the web. Our research group has been involved in all the other checkup iterations that you see here. And so we've developed checkups for marijuana use for both adults and adolescents, which I'll talk more about, for substance abuse with soldiers, perpetrators of domestic violence, HIV risk behavior, and we just got a grant from the DoD to work with PTSD with soldiers. And you can see we're very creative with our names of the programs. So the adult marijuana checkup was conducted here by my colleagues Bob Stevens and Roger Rothman. And it, again, was really interested in looking at in just the idea, can you elicit self-referral from folks who are using marijuana but not entering treatment or seeking treatment? And here's a great example of an advertisement that we used within this trial. Questions about your pot use? Call the marijuana checkup. It's for adults who have questions. It's not a treatment program. It's free and confidential. Your marijuana use got you thinking? We address concerns and questions. No pressure to change, free and confidential. So again, this is very different than maybe what a treatment program might advertise. And it's really intending to welcome people who are thinking about changing their use or thinking about how their use is affecting them, not necessarily ready to make an abstinence commitment or quit specifically. We conducted a randomized clinical trial intending to attract self-referral, and essentially what we found is that participants who were attracted to this intervention looked very similar to the participants who engaged in our treatment programs with regard to level of use and also problems that they were experiencing, with a few exceptions. They reported a little bit fewer problems and met fewer dependence criteria, but the far majority of them had a marijuana disorder, either meeting dependence or abuse, and likely they would not have sought treatment, formal treatment. And the MET intervention reduced use more than a control condition at the 7-week follow-up. It wasn't significant at 6 months, but it was marginally significant at the 12-month follow-up. So again, this program was able to attract folks who wouldn't seek treatment, but looked very similar to a treatment population as far as clinical severity, and it was able to enact some change, or at least prompt some change among these individuals. We wondered if this could work for adolescents, because adolescents are even at a greater disadvantage for wanting to self-refer to treatment. Adolescents don't have any problems ever that they self-refer for, and if they were interested in treatment, they would have to go through their parent. They're not financially stable. They'd have to figure out some way to pay for that. There are additional barriers, I think, for kids than there are with adults even. So for this program, we had to think a little bit about, again, how do you reduce those barriers that might get in the way of someone participating in an intervention like this? And one of the adaptations that we made was we decided, hey, let's bring this intervention to them. If we bring it to them in school during the school day, that might increase access or participation. They were individual sessions. We had a computerized assessment, and we didn't require parental consent. We thought that would really get in the way of people participating. No pressure, no judgment, not treatment, and very brief. So the recruitment strategies had to be really altered. And so instead of just doing advertisements, which we put flyers up around the schools, our main source of advertising was doing these classroom presentations where health educators would go into the classes, they would present information on the myths and facts of marijuana. And at the end of the presentation, everybody would get like a presentation review form. We'd tell them about the teen marijuana checkup. And if they were interested, they could just write their name on the evaluation, the presentation evaluation form. Everybody folds them up and sends them back up. And it was a confidential or anonymous way to give us their information and to let us know that they were interested in hearing more about the teen marijuana checkup. We also got a lot of referrals from friends, some self-referrals, and referrals from school staff. The teen marijuana checkup is probably the checkup that we've done the most research on at IPRG. In fact, we've just completed the 4th trial on an iteration of this work. And what we've found is that adolescents totally will volunteer for this intervention. Over 4 trials, we had over 700 kids participate in our trials. And really the only limiting factor was our staffing. Kids were very willing and interested in doing this, this intervention and participating, and they found it very acceptable. The sample that it attracted was a heavy using sample and very treatment naive. So most of them, the far majority, 90%, has never had any treatment experience with substance abuse. But their levels of use, levels of abuse and dependence, and also their levels on like internalizing and externalizing measures were similar to what you see in adolescent treatment literature. So the clinical severity was high. And what we found was that MET intervention reduced marijuana use more than education or delayed feedback control. And that was replicated in our last trial. But when we offered CBT, like an abstinence-based kind of treatment to kids who took advantage of the motivational enhancement therapy, we got between 11 and 25% of kids took advantage of that. So depending on how you think about that, it could be high or low, but it probably wasn't what we wanted as far as the numbers, but that's what we got. What we know is that the checkup model does, in fact, and has been shown in multiple different forms to attract clinically severe people to an intervention who otherwise would not seek treatment. And when they do refer, the sample that we attract looks very similar to a treatment population, and the checkup model is able to promote behavior change, both in reductions in use, problems related to use, but the effects are pretty small to moderate. There are several successful adaptations of the checkup that have been delivered over the phone, and at the same time, we know that it's a really great model to reach people who are not being reached. These interventions are not widely available. What we still need to know is how do we improve outcomes? How do we help those kids or adults reduce more, both their use or their problems? How do we extend the outcomes over a longer period of time? One of the bigger questions is who's going to pay for it? So checkup interventions have really only been offered as part of research, and so they've been offered free within the research. So is it reimbursable under insurance? Will people pay for this kind of an intervention? Might this be a viable option for a statewide helpline? Might this be a viable option for something that, like Bia was talking about, for that could really meet people where they were at, calling a hotline or a helpline in Washington State? And there's still a lot to know about how a program like this can be implemented in the real world. Thank you for listening.
Keep those questions coming. So the next speaker really is sort of the treatment analog to the prevention focus that Kevin talked about earlier. Susan Stoner is a research consultant at the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, also a clinical psychologist whose training was here at the UW with a focus on substance abuse. She's worked for organizations that have developed web-based trainings of a variety of sorts, including screening and brief intervention, focus on diversity, things such as that in medical settings and other areas. Most recently, as part of this particular presentation, she's been tasked with, if you will, the opportunity to look at, as part of the DBHR process, what are the evidence-based interventions for adolescents around marijuana as well as other substance uses. So, Susan.
Okay, thank you, Dennis, and welcome to the last talk of the day. Thank you all for hanging in there with me. I should be relatively brief. We'll see how it goes. So following on what Dr. Haggerty and Dr. Walker just talked about, this really sort of boils down to what we have to offer people when they do self-refer for treatment or otherwise come in for treatment. And although my title is really about challenges in treating youth cannabis use disorders with evidence-based practices, it's more about challenges in identifying evidence-based practices for treating youth with cannabis use disorders. So as we've talked about already, I-502 allocates funds to DBHR for programs and practices aimed at prevention or reduction of maladaptive substance use among middle school and high school students. And as Dr. Haggerty mentioned, at least 85% of those must be, or 85% of those funds must be directed to evidence-based and cost-beneficial programs and practices that produce objectively measurable results. And then up to 15% may be directed to research-based and emerging best practices or promising practices. So in deciding which programs to fund, DBHR is to consult at least annually with UW's SDRG for the prevention side and ADAI for the treatment side. So the task to ADAI was to prepare an inventory of evidence-based, research-based, and promising practices for the treatment of maladaptive substance use in adolescents, and that's to help guide DBHR's funding decisions. So it's actually a pretty important thing to do, right? Because this is what we have to offer our youth. So considering how important it is, there better be some definitions for evidence-based, research-based, and promising. And there are. They're set forth in our CW 7124-025, which says that an evidence-based program or practice is one that's been tested in heterogeneous or intended populations with multiple randomized or statistically controlled evaluations, or both, or one large multiple site randomized statistically controlled evaluation, or both, where the weight of the evidence from a systematic, I believe, review demonstrates sustained improvements in at least one outcome, and also those that can be implemented with a set of procedures to allow successful replication in Washington, and when possible, is determined to be cost beneficial. So this is like verbatim from the law. Research-based program or practice is tested with a single randomized or statistically controlled evaluation, or both, demonstrating sustained desirable outcomes, or where the weight of evidence from a systemic review supports sustained outcomes, but does not meet the full criteria for evidence-based. And then finally, promising is based on statistical analyses or well-established theory of change, shows potential for meeting the evidence-based or research-based criteria, which may include the use of a program that's evidence-based for outcomes other than those listed under the definition of evidence-based. So, looking over those definitions, it's clear that it seems like a lot of thought went into making those definitions and putting that out there. However, when you actually try to use those definitions to identify evidence-based practices, you start to really notice the vagueness, and it's kind of problematic. So that was really challenging for us in this effort. So there's always some degree of interpretation required. So first of all, what outcomes are we talking about here? Are we specifically talking about substance use outcomes, or are we talking about problems emerging from substance use? How much improvement is enough? There's really nothing in the law. It talks about sustained desirable outcomes. Well, how much is desirable? how much does it need to be to not be disappointing? Sustained for how long? Do like 3 months and then it goes away, or 6 months, a year, like how long? And then finally, what are the suitable controls or comparison conditions? There are a number of studies that where two treatments are being compared to each other and there's no treatment arm, so you don't really know if either of those is better than nothing at all. So that's also kind of challenging. So our interpretation was to focus on standardized manualized treatments because that's what's going to be able to enable replication in Washington State, is using the manuals. And we focused on randomized controlled trials, so kind of really looking at whether there's a single trial with a single site versus multiple trials or a single trial with multiple sites. That's kind of the pivot for evidence-based versus research-based. We decided to focus on substance use-oriented outcomes, although it could certainly be argued that maybe those aren't the best to look at. Like, who cares if they don't reduce their substance use if their life gets better? I think that's open to debate. And then finally, we looked at statistical significance. Going into this sort of naively, I really was hoping to be able to think more in terms of clinical significance, but in really wading into the literature was sort of struck by the reality that the bulk of the studies that are out there really don't enable you to say much about statistical significance, and clinical significance, and they're really focused on statistical significance. So for this first effort, that's what we focused on as well. And then, in terms of sustained for how long, really, I kind of operationalized that in terms of whether it just had a post-test only or a post-test with some kind of follow-up, whether it's 3 months or 6 months or beyond. So another consideration we had is, well, what have others in Washington done? Well, we've talked a little bit about WSIP, as Dr. Haggerty referred to, and showed you that list of evidence-based programs there. The treatment ones were those 3 ones in green on the bottom. So in their 2014 updated review of the evidence, there's really only 3 treatment programs examined that I could tell, and only one of them was deemed evidence-based, and that's the teen marijuana checkup. And they were really focusing on benefit-cost analysis and heterogeneity. As a clinical psychologist, I don't do cost-benefit analysis, and the research literature is really not there yet, so we really didn't include that in our ADAI approach. Then we were also interested to take a look at what other lists or inventories exist. So I mentioned the WSIP one. SAMHSA also has NREP, as many of you know, and that rates programs from 0 to 4. The Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention has a model programs guide that rates programs as effective, promising, or having no effects. And then there's the California Evidence-Based Clearinghouse rating list based on how well it's supported by the evidence. And then there's also the Blueprints for Healthy Youth Development. So devising ADI's strategy was kind of a challenge. First, we wanted to examine all the treatments that are found on other lists. We don't want to leave anything out that other people have taken into consideration. And then we wanted to identify additional treatments that are out there that maybe weren't on the lists through PubMed and Google Scholar searches and citation indices. And we really wanted to look at original studies. We consulted but didn't rely at all upon literature reviews or meta-analyses. Again, you could kind of debate whether that's the way to go, but that's the way we did it. And then finally, we excluded phone, web, internet, and smartphone-based treatments, and those primarily delivered on college campuses or in correctional settings. And in doing that, we were really just trying to stay true to the language of the law, where the focus was on middle school and high school age, so we kind of didn't look at college. And also it seemed that really a major purpose of this was to be able to tell treatment agencies what were the sanctioned practices, and so we've sort of relegated phone, web, internet, and smartphone-based to the future. So in terms of findings, we looked at 24 treatment approaches and rated them according to their level of evidence. 6 of them were deemed evidence-based, 5 research-based, 11 promising, and 1 unsupported. And before I sort of show the list of what each one was, I will say, like, just because something is landed on the evidence-based list does not mean that it's superior to anything that's not on that list. It just goes to show, for the most part, that there just needs to be more research. There's just not enough research. So the evidence-based treatments were adolescent community reinforcement approach, brief intervention and motivational interviewing, cognitive behavioral therapy, functional family therapy, MET, CBT, multidimensional family therapy, and also just giving you this list. Another challenge I didn't put on the slide that sort of comes up is, from study to study, there's a fair degree of methodological variation from study to study. Like MET, CBT, there's a 5-session version and a 7-session version and a 12-session version. Like, how do you take that into consideration? I tended to lump them all together, but you could argue that maybe you shouldn't do that. Lots of choice points here and there. The research-based treatments were assertive continuing care, contingency management, ecological-based family therapy, family behavior therapy, the teen marijuana checkup, although I was only aware of 2 studies, so that looked for that to be moving to the EBP list. Promising treatments, there's the similar but somewhat different adolescent cannabis checkup out of Australia, brief strategic family therapy, the CBOP, Chestnut Bloomington outpatient program. There's the culturally informed and flexible family-based treatment for Hispanics, community reinforcement and family training, and motivational enhancement therapy. The rest of them, MET, CBT, aftercare, multisystemic therapy, seeking safety for adolescents, strengths-oriented family therapy, structural ecosystems therapy, and the 7 challenges. So that's actually, if you count them all up, that's 23. There's only 1 that was unsupported. So that's good news, right? Like, I wasn't finding that there's a lot out there that really doesn't work. It's just there's not enough out there that has risen to the level to sort of meet the criteria, the definitions. So if you're interested in, I'm not going to say anything more about any of those, I'm practically out of time, but there are links to these, the full inventory and the research brief on the ADI website, so feel free to check those out if you're interested. So that takes us to what we know. We know there are several evidence-based treatment options for maladaptive substance use by adolescents. However, many well-respected treatments did not make the list, and usually that's because there was only a single RCT, or perhaps there were some mixed findings, or a lack of effect on substance use outcomes. So again, if we expand our scope and look at not just substance use outcomes, probably some can move up the tree. What we still need to know, I'd really like some more clarity in these definitions. I don't know who's going to give that to me, but that would certainly be helpful if maybe we could build some consensus as a field. Additional studies are certainly needed to convert research-based and promising practice into the evidence-based column. Additional studies are needed to perform cost-benefit analysis. That's just, we don't have enough information on that. And perhaps most importantly, are we meeting the needs of Washington's adolescents? What really wanted to try to balance inclusivity and giving options for treatment agencies to provide treatment programs to meet the needs of our youth. On the other hand, wanting to be true to the definitions set forth in I-502. And, it's a tough balance to strike. And if we're not meeting the needs of our adolescents, what more can be done to meet those needs? So just like to acknowledge DBHR and ADAI for supporting this work, and much appreciation to Nancy Sutherland for her help with this. Thank you.
So I'll stay over here because I'm an upstanding citizen. It's getting late, I have to admit. So we do have some questions, and I see others being collected. Let me start with and actually, this could be one to all of you at some level. So even though it's initially addressed to Kevin, do you anticipate that the context of legalization will impact the effectiveness of the current marijuana EBPs, the evidence-based practices? So that could be true of either the prevention programs or the intervention programs. What do you see as this changing, evolving legalization process having as far as its impact on the utility, the success, the outcomes associated with those preventive and interventive interventions?
The short answer to that is yes. And partly because when we look at so many of the EBPs, it's really interesting. And even when I've been to conferences recently, people are presenting their outcomes and they'll say, you know, it had an impact on alcohol use and tobacco use and other illegal substances. And I'll say, marijuana is not an illegal substance in Washington State. Could you break out marijuana from other illegal substances? And I think it's a really important thing because as researchers, we have to be looking at the specificity. Now, there are programs like Life Skills Training that have broken out marijuana specificity, but when you look at the curriculum materials, they're still written as if marijuana is illegal. So I do think that there has to be adaptation or responsiveness of the program materials to a legal context, and that's going to impact those programs as they're delivered. So there has to be some shift in how they're delivered, I think, to make them as robust as they can be.
Susan, do you want to say anything?
From the treatment side, I would just say, you know, maybe it's a scientific cop-out, but I would say it's an empirical question. I mean, we really don't know. It's a grand experiment, as we've heard over and over today. I mean, to the extent that treatment is dependent on people sort of winding up in treatment, I would say, I mean, I would sort of hypothesize that no, legalization wouldn't have an effect. It's because they might have an effect in the numbers of people that present for treatment, but in terms of moderating the treatment effect itself, I would be skeptical about that. But I don't know. It's entirely an empirical question.
Denise?
Our last teen marijuana checkup trial actually covered the period 2 years prior to legalization and 2 years after. And we really didn't see a difference in the people who were interested in treatment, and the effects were decent. There was no real control group because we were actually scientifically manipulating an aftercare intervention to see if we could improve the effect of the teen marijuana checkup. But as far as participation from kids, they were just as interested post-legalization as they were pre-legalization. And I feel like the legalization piece has the most threat for adolescents and even for adults in just the changing of norms and also of the healthiness of marijuana. So if it's legal, it might be considered less harmful, more healthy, and the idea that norms might be changed and the perception is that people are using more. And I think those are the major threats to even, you know, treatment seeking or intervention efficacy.
Okay. So I'm going to blend two questions together here. The first part of it, and so let me read the two and then you'll see how they blend, I hope. How should the state and providers balance evidence base with cultural relevance, particularly for small groups in which it is more difficult to collect evidence, such as in American Indians? And are you looking at EBTs for different ethnicities and gender for youth? And is that an important factor to take into consideration?
In my inventory, I did sort of break out the proportion for each study that of the different race and ethnicity groups. But in terms of doing any sort of formal analysis of that, I didn't do that. I do think it's a really important consideration in an ideal world where we had a lot of research available. I think that's a really important thing to take a look at, but the studies don't exist to enable us to really break it down and see. You don't get enough people in the subgroups to sort of see if race moderates response to the treatment. And I sound like a broken record, but more studies need to be done on that.
I definitely think that the 85-15 is an important thing, that the 15% does need to be going to looking at programs that might be working with smaller subpopulations that are really important to address. The EBPs and the prevention side, they range kind of across gender and different cultural contexts for implementation, but there's not enough of any of them for any specific culture, especially for smaller, like Native American is an area where we need far more evidence-based prevention programs. There's just no question. Many different types of smaller cultural contexts, Somali population, for example. Those are really important questions that we need to do more research on. So we have the marijuana fund. It would be important to put marijuana fund money into being able to do research on finding programs that have a strong empirical evidence and don't do damage for different groups. So I think it is important to know that there's been enough research that's been conducted where there are programs that not only don't do good, but actually make things worse for kids. I think the 21st century after-school grants is an example of one that people are surprised about, that actually has an iatrogenic effect for substance use. So it's like, okay, well, maybe we need to be thinking about where else we're putting our resources, so we're not doing damage.
Okay. I have a question, Denise, for you. Did the teen checkup intervention offer teens money to participate? Were the kids just doing it to get the money to buy weed?
Yeah, that's a great question. So with all research, we tend to incentivize, at the very least, the participation in the research assessments. In the first 3 trials, we did provide small incentives for participation in the intervention itself, so $15 gift cards to participate in the intervention. And that was because they were efficacy trials, and we wanted to make sure that the kids actually participated in the intervention so that we could study its effects. In our last trial, we didn't offer any incentive for taking part in the counseling sessions. We only offered incentives for the follow-ups and the aftercare intervention that we were manipulating. And we got similar rates of participation, which were between 98 and 100% completion of MET sessions 1 and 2. So that suggests to me that although, yes, it may have been an incentive to participate over the long term, these kids didn't actually get an incentive payment until, I think, the 4-month follow-up period. And so if they were participating for the money, it was a testament to their delayed gratification. And it suggests to me that the intervention itself was interesting enough. I also would say that I feel like small incentives might be worth thinking about getting kids or adults to participate in something that could promote healthy behavior. You see this with insurance companies now, if you're part of the UW system, who goes on and does the little web assessment thing so that they can get money off of their insurance. I think that should be considered. I don't think it should be looked at as something negative, but maybe should be, could be used to our benefit to engage kids in participating in something that can promote healthy behaviors for them.
One of the things that has been demonstrated in the substance abuse field is that one of the most effective interventions is contingency management, in which rewards of different sorts for behaviors that are sought after, that you hope to change, so that there may be benefit to that.
That's actually a treatment program that we're using in the trial that I shamelessly plugged in my thing. And there's brochures in the back if you're interested.
So this is a, and are you incentivizing us to take those?
Go ahead and take them, yeah.
Another one, I think, to you, Denise. How is it that the substance abusers determined to be in that 90% of the pie are identified? You know, you're saying that they may have a problem, but they're not seeking treatment. What is the nature or severity of their problem? Is there any information known about that?
So that was National Survey on Drug Use and Health Behavior, or the survey for that. So it's a national survey, and those were people who met criteria for an abuse or dependence disorder on a substance. So that's how they defined it.
Okay.
And, you know, that can be up for negotiation as far as
Okay.
treatment worthy.
Another one. Please talk about social neighborhood impacts such as local action or lack of elected officials to support or hinder risk factors and protective factors. So I think it would be, what about the local community level facilitative versus inhibitory effects of politicians or policies or so on, and the preventive work you do in the communities, Kevin?
Well, I think what we've found in the work we've done is when communities come together and they have a coalition of active people that are supported both by key leaders and stakeholders in the community that care about the development of young people, you can see significant community level reductions in the initiation of marijuana, of alcohol, tobacco, crime, violence. So there is a real need to have the support of elected officials, those key leaders who are the opinion shapers and resource holders in the community, to support prevention efforts. And when those key leaders and those elected officials are supportive and adopt that evidence-based prevention kind of programming, you see significant impacts on youth outcomes. So it's a really fundamentally important element of a community prevention effort, to have kind of the key leader stakeholders, those elected officials and opinion shapers, a part of that community coalition.
Has there been research related to the protective factors such as increasing involvement of big sisters or big brothers or after-school programs, extracurricular activities in the preventive process? Or what role do those play?
Yeah, so that's a really interesting question, because in work we've done with communities that care, where we've looked at can communities actually elevate protective factors through the social development strategy, and we can measure impact on increasing those protective factors at the family level, the school level, the peer level, and the community level, so that young people are growing up in a more protected environment when communities come together and have programs like the ones you mentioned available that provide those opportunities, skills, recognition, bonding, and healthy beliefs and clear standards. So when communities intentionally do that, you can get a public health community level effect on stronger protection in a community. So it does seem it appears that communities can have this really powerful protective buffering effect as well.
What studies have you done with industry members around prevention and responsible use regulation, if any? I think it's the if any.
I think that's such fertile ground, and I think that's an area for more research needed.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I just think it's a great question. It's an area that we really do need to work with industry and see how they can join the prevention effort through education materials and even conversation with the bud tenders might provide to customers. So it's a rich and fertile area for prevention.
It's a growth industry.
It's a growth industry. Thanks, Dennis.
You're welcome. So the last one may not be specific to this panel, but I just share it. Is there any funding going to medical use of cannabis for qualifying conditions such as PTSD and chronic pain?
Is that a question for Washington State? Probably
It's-
not.
It doesn't specify, but I would think that if we were to be able to speak to it with respect to Washington State, it would localize it.
I don't think it is in Washington State, because I haven't seen any, I don't think we've done that, unless you know of anything. But in Colorado, they're doing specific RCTs for PTSD. There are 2 PTSD-related medical approaches. I think they have one for ADHD. And I think they have 6 randomized controlled trials around different areas. PTSD is definitely is part of 2 of them. I think ADHD is one. It's really interesting to look at those. They started them about a year ago, so they're in process now.
So I just mentioned, let me just mention this, that actually the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, using its I-502 funds, have funded a number of small pilot projects, one of which is at the VA Medical Center. Andy Saxon is here as one of the co-investigators on that. Kendall Brown, Kendall Brown right there with the hand up, is the principal investigator, and they're looking at issues having to do with marijuana use and PTSD. Okay. So hopefully we will have some localized information that will be generated out of our small grants program. So I'm pleased to be able to announce that, actually. So
That's great.
This is just a side.
Decisions like in the last few days.
Oh, just a side note, I wish that list was more evidence-based as far as how you get conditions on that list for medical marijuana.
It was interesting because I had attended a workshop on marijuana that actually Denise was one of the mentors for, and her colleague at that point, Alan Budney, was commenting about how it was that things get on the list. And I thought it was somewhat interesting because what he said was he had gotten this call from Vermont that again was interested in knowing about what is it that they do and how is it they get things onto the list, and whether they could put PTSD onto the list. And his comment, somewhat tongue-in-cheek, was, well, you may as well put it on because there's not lots of evidence for any of the other ones that are up there yet. So it's one of those things where we still are looking for the evidence to support, in many cases, the utility and the efficacy of marijuana in its different forms to be therapeutic in those kind of medical conditions, so we don't really know. We do, by the way, again, sort of plugging some of what we do at the Alcohol and Drug Abuse Institute, do have a training on the use of medicinal cannabis for pain management. So if people are interested in that, it's available on our website. There is the opportunity to get medical CME, continuing medical education, so be aware that that's available as well. So we are at the end of our time for the panel, and it's time for me to sort of wrap up. And what I'd like to say is just a couple of things. First of all, I want to thank people for being here and staying here throughout the day. It's been a long day. It's been one with lots of information, somewhat information overload, it felt at times, which is often the case with the symposia like this. I want to encourage people to go back to the Seattle Times editorial that Kevin mentioned earlier in his presentation. I think it was on May 18th. That talks about the distribution of funds from the original intended dispersals of I-502 to what it is actually currently. The University of Washington was supposed to get 0.6% to conduct research. As I saw on the slide that actually Rick Garza presented this morning, we got 0.13, so that's considerably less than 0.6. And Washington State University is supposed to get 0.4, and it was considerably lower than that. If you looked at his projections, Rick Garza's projections, that 0.13 in the next fiscal year, relative to the amount of excise tax being collected, drops down to 0.08. Now, we know what 0.08 does when you hit it with alcohol and driving. We're not quite sure what it does when you hit it for funding. But again, I encourage you to look at that editorial because it raises a series of questions about where the money has been distributed relative to where it was intended. The other thing that I think is important is that the thing that always comes out in conferences like this, you can say it with a great degree of certainty, no matter which conference it is, that there's always the need for more research. And I want to commend the people that are here who are my colleagues, our colleagues throughout the university system, broadly speaking, for the work that they're doing. Because I think, again, this is, as was said earlier today, this is a brave new world. And we don't know all of it. We heard lots about policy, we heard how it impacts, we heard about the need for public health focus, we heard about the needs for evidence-based preventive and interventive processes, but yet we still need to do the work to understand, and as was pointed out, I think actually, in what Susan Stoner raised, is that even if you see something on a list that's up here or down here, you don't know whether what's up here compares well to this one because we haven't done comparative effectiveness trials yet. I mean, we barely have done efficacy studies to look at these things, and yet we don't know what happens in the real world oftentimes when we put it into practice in a day-to-day basis. So I encourage all of us who are in the business of doing research to go forth and do research. I think the other is that for those who inform policy, using research findings to inform policy, go forth and inform. And those who make it, go forth and make policy that makes sense, that in fact reduces harm and minimizes the likelihood of developing problems of dependence downstream. That's what we're all about. You know, that I-502, I think, is, as it had been proposed, as the intent had been determined early on, was seen as a visionary approach to both, one, legalize with some of that focus that Alexis Harris talked about of the decriminalization process and the diversity issues involved in it, but on the other hand, to ensure that we had sufficient funds to do the kind of work we need to prevent, to treat, and to provide public health observance and monitoring across time. So those are my words of wisdom. They may not be that wise, but at least I said them. I'd also just like to close and thank, I thanked you for being here, but I want to thank the people who made this possible for you to be here. And Bia Carlini, who has been coordinating our marijuana research at ADAI, was really the person who headed this organization process. We had helpers, obviously, Nancy Sutherland in the logistics. Mike Lane, who comes out of the back closet from time to time when, you know, if you have the flashing. It reminded me when I was a senior in college, I had an honors project in which I was using a tachistoscope. Anyone know what a tachistoscope is anymore? Oh man, I'm dating myself. It's a projector that flashes things up quickly, and it's to see whether you can see, how long it takes you to see it. Okay, and that was kind of what it was. So that it flashed me back all the way to undergraduate school, which is really problematic. So I want to thank Robin Harwick and Sharon Garrett and Dennis Wendt, who are all part of the organizational planning group, and I want to thank Meg up here with the 5, 2, and 0 minutes left to keep us on time, and I want to thank the folks who helped sort of check you in the morning, and I hope you all have an enjoyable evening. If you use lightly and safely. Thank you.